alright, I'm finally ready to admit it. Even though I've made a decent amount of progress reviewing cartoons in the past, I still have to say it, I have a problem. Well, many problems in fact, but for now let's focus on just one. By this point it's fair to say this is becoming a pattern for me. Despite hearing about a show during the prime of its legacy, I make the choice to ignore said show until it's on the last leg of its story, or worse, already over. And then I end up loving it to pieces, but also realizing I missed out on what could have been a memorable journey that could have spanned for months or years even, but just turned into a more down-to-earth binge spanning for a few mere days. I've met this tragic fate on different occasions, with Gravity Falls, The Owl House, Infinity Train, and Glitch Techs, which you better believe I'm gonna write a script for later on, as it's my most recent incident. But then we got shows like Amphibia, a Disney show that ended last year and ended up getting a rather huge fan following. And as you can obviously tell, I ignored it until more recently. The show ended last year and it took me now to finally get to it. But unlike these other shows, starting my run through with this show wasn't all on me. I was convinced by a girl in my workplace to check this show out, and I'm assuming she's watching this now. Good to see you if that's the case. So, how did this show hold up compared to the others I've been going through as of late? Well, first things first, before getting to that, we should learn the basics and go into some of the history first. The show started up back in 2019. It was brought to us by Matt Braley and his crew, and was sprouted from inspiration based on Braley's memories in Thailand, and influenced by a variety of media pieces he experienced over the years. Various movies, cartoons, video games, you name it, they all played parts. While watching, you might notice throughout the show there are numerous characters and tropes in the story that may remind you of someone or something you might have seen somewhere else. But it's no coincidence. It was a matter of influence, and handled fairly well, I'd say. In fact, Matt himself said one of his biggest points to making the show was to make an adventure that would make people think about Gravity Falls, but from the perspective of someone like Pacifica. A character with a big story arc of redemption can almost always lead to interesting aspects in said character's journey. Just look at Amity from The Owl House. She too went through a giant redemption arc, changing in more ways than one, and that was one of those things that made her one of my favorite characters in the show. And speaking of change, I never once considered that the frog dimension trope itself would have also played a part in that concept. Matt once explained the connection was all about change, like how these characters, or any character from any franchise that go through development, can be the equivalent of an average frog's life cycle. And I feel Matt deserves some credit for that thought process because my god, that is actually really clever. Though while not everything in Amphibia was ideal, sometimes I feel like they can go a little too far with some elements, like with gross out tropes or characters starting to act obnoxious from out of nowhere, but at least they never make it unbearable. Usually those elements are just used as a quick gag. It happens, and it's done. While kinda overplayed at times, these kinds of jokes never overstay their welcome when they do happen, and I can appreciate that the writers and producers had some decent timing on that. But of course we've still got the story to go through, so let's dive right in. The show setup is kinda similar to the Owl House, a magical item taking a person from the real world, which leaves them in another world to live there for a while, and let them grow as a person over time while stuck there. But instead of doors and Titan's blood, the main plot device is a music box and its gems. And this time there are 3 humans trying to adapt to this new world. These girls end up in different parts of Amphibia: Marcy in Newtopia, Sasha in Toad Tower, and Anne in Wartwood, with each of them learning about Amphibia from the sources they're provided to them, which leads to different results. Sasha's proven to be pretty aggressive already, but her time with the Toads gives her the encouragement to go further, which leads to more destructive actions later on. Marcy was probably given the most pure route to start off, as she ended up in the fancy town of Newtopia, where she wants to do everything she can to fight for the heroes, which is pretty ironic for reasons I'll get to later. And Anne, well, is mostly neutral on her end. Some of her journeys are to fight for good, and some for mischief. It mostly depends on the characters she ends up running into, and there's a hefty variety of characters we're introduced to in Wartwood alone. There's the Planter family, who I'll go more into in a bit, One-Eyed Wally, who will also be important later, Mayor Toadstool, who can be a very problematic politician at times, and even leads to a major plotline around the end of the season, but regardless, he still gets support from his assistant, Toadie, who will also get a bit of time to shine later, and there are 2 others I'd like to draw some attention to for now: Ivy and Maddie, 2 girls whose Sprague ended up in a relationship at one point or another. And I have a feeling I'm gonna get some backlash for saying this, But while I think Ivy made a great addition to the show, and while I'm glad she and Sprig are happy together, and Anne's more than happy for them too, I still think Maddie was a slightly better character. She had a decent amount of potential with her personality, she's proven to be very helpful with magic, and she had more moments that managed to give me more of a smile. But then again, I completely understand why Sprig would like Ivy more. I mean, sure, his introduction with Maddie was kind of forced onto him, and I can understand that no one wants to go through that. Plus, Ivy's tomboyish personality does help give her some charm, and they've known each other much longer, which greatly helped with their connection. So yeah, Ivy and Sprig hit it off pretty well, but I still wish we got more from Maddie. She may have had some nice screen time in later episodes, but I feel she had the potential to have more episodes about her in general. Think about it. A young girl with a mysterious attitude practicing magic? That sounds like they could have gone much further with that kind of character. Well, now let's start focusing more on the humans. Just a heads up, this is where spoilers really start pouring out. So if you haven't seen the show yet but plan to, it's best to hit the road, fellas. The rest of us are gonna head onward. Since Anne's the main focus here, she has the most going on, so let's get her out of the way first. She was given a roof thanks to the planters, Sprig, Hop Hop, and Polly. Get it? Polly? Like Pollywog? Get it? But Anne's not the only one who offers build-up to the story. Marcy played another big role in their Amphibia adventure starting up. Not only that, she was the one who found the music box in the first place, or the Calamity Box as it's later known as. And later on, she convinced Sasha to convince Anne to steal it, which is what brought them to Amphibia in the first place. And what was Marcy's reason for doing so? Because her parents had plans to move away due to her dad getting a new job. And Marcy thought this box would have made everything better. Because as we all learned from past shows, that kind of thinking never leads to any consequences. I'm looking at you, Mabel. But again, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. And last but not least, we got Sasha too, who probably had the biggest setup for redemption out of the three girls, since she was the one who teamed up with a villain, or I should say an obvious villain. I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about, but if not, well, we'll get to that little twist later. Sasha even went as far as to attack her own friends for the sake of dominance, until, well, again, spoilers. And I'm getting way too ahead of myself anyway, but like I said, we'll also get to that point in due time. The best way I can explain the relationship between these three is, well, it's practically the same connection we got from the original trio in Deltarune. With Sasha obviously being Susie, the type who usually gets aggressive easily and thinks fighting's the only true way to solve everything, though that kind of changes later on. I guess that would make Anne Chris and Marcy Ralsei? Actually, yeah, that kind of fits well with them. Marcy is the one who leans more toward pacifism, up to a point anyway, and Anne's proven she can go either way if given good enough reasons, although she prefers sticking to the positives of any situation. So alright, the show had a bit of charm to it from the beginning. A world of frogs and other creatures of that ilk is something that's never really been done to this degree. It seemed like there would be a lot of potential to unfold here, and there was even in the first season. Although I felt the first 7 episodes were, honestly, a little too sluggish in story terms for the most part. I mean, they weren't bad. They did a good job helping us learn about the characters and the atmosphere, which there's nothing wrong with, but I don't know, I still thought 7 episodes was a bit much, and kinda gave a dragging feeling to the story, especially since we're dealing with 14 10-minute segments, mind you, and I usually don't have problems with filler or hangout episodes being thrown into the story of a show. My main issue was that it mostly felt like there were too many in a row. However, they still managed to deliver some decent substance with these first few episodes and segments, like in Best Franz. There was a scene where Anne starts pushing Sprig around, and by first impressions, this would make it look like Anne's supposed to be the unlikable character type to some. At least that was how I saw it. But this actually turns out to be a case of foreshadowing. This way of thinking wasn't solely coming from Anne, she was just misguided by Sasha, whom we knew, well, nothing about at this point, so no one knew what she was going to act like in the first place. This line of hinting I feel made for some great character build-up. It was a pretty nice touch, and I'm sure it led everyone to wonder what more we were going to get from Anne and Sasha's friendship at the time. But aside from those points, there really wasn't a whole lot to point out in those episodes. However, after episode 7, the story starts to move at a bit more of a noticeable pace. And what made this shift in the story? Well, as it turns out, Hop Hop knows a thing or two about the music box. Heck, he even knows its actual name, the Calamity Box. But he refuses to let Anne know about it for her own safety for the time being. But still, there was nothing too drastic right away. The story was still giving out more simple plot lines, but with some sweet doses of continuity starting to sprinkle in. And at this point in the story, I can appreciate that kind of flow. And even in this season, there were still a few episodes that I found quite intriguing, particularly Family Shrub and Trip to the Archives. With these kinds of episodes, they managed to make some neat little adventures with the limits they had in the story at this point. Plus there were a few episodes who introduced some villains who I won't go into right away, as they have more of a role to play at a later point. So the characters we met before were given bigger roles over time, which adds some extra roots in the plotline, which also introduces more to be put at stake as the show went along, with some of said more impactful episodes being Toad Tax and Prison Break. Toad Tax gave off a real first impression of the Toad army outside of the tower, who Anne thought she could have trusted until she saw how harmful they really are and had to turn against them. And Prison Break shows how Sasha gained the trust of their leader, Captain Grime, and became his partner. Both of these episodes were the start of bigger routes to the story, though Prison Break had a bigger impact as it managed to extend to more frequent occurrences in later seasons. And this builds up to the Toads, who proved to be one of Wartwood's biggest threats they encounter at the time. So yeah, after Sasha was captured by the Toads, she becomes not just partners, but friends with Grime, and they train the army together. But honestly, the build up to the Toads' invasion was a little questionable, since they wanted to bring down the whole town and its residents, only because of the mayor's malicious intentions alone? Why not just target him? He was the only one who was hiding the money from them. But there was still a plus side to all this. Not only did Anne get the chance to meet up with Sasha again, but she also shows how strong she's gotten. Even though she kinda had to just defend herself against Sasha, which leaves Sasha unconscious, which I'm sure left many to worry about her. Sure, she gave off a nasty first impression, but she's still Anne's friend deep inside. So by the start of Season 2, we get our first big story arc, bigger than anything that was offered in Season 1. The planners are taking Anne on a road trip with them, heading over to Newtopia. As they now know, the Calamity Box had a connection there, so already we have a pretty solid start to the season. And not only that, there were plenty of interesting stops they made along the way, which made for interesting challenges on their own, like the factory that created Frobo, who ends up more charming than I was expecting. He and Polly made a surprisingly nice friendship. The family also visits Ribbitville, where they learn about Wally's secret life, and we also get to see Crumpet the Frog. But we all know it was obvious they were going for that. They even went the extra mile to get Mike Vogel, Kermit's current voice actor, for this guy too. And that was priceless. I like the fact that they made the Kermit reference alone, but giving him the official voice too, that was brilliant, and I love it. And of course there was that episode, the episode that got the attention of many at the time, Wax Museum, aka the Gravity Falls crossover. Man, this was something else. It wasn't enough to just throw in a handful of references from the show, but once again they took the extra mile to get Alex Hirsch to come back and reprise his stand voice for the Curator.
Oh, this is beautiful.
Not only that, but they gave him the personality too. Despite being the villain in this episode, he's still got the same behavior that Stan would have had. This not only gives off the impression that Stan could have made a very believable villain in another context, but straight up shows it too. And this shift of perspective just made the trope more amusing than I was expecting. Aside from these surprising cameos, there's also an impressive half of the story uncovered in this season. After Anne reunites with Marcy in Newtopia, they find out about the temples and the challenges inside they have to face in order to bring the power back to the box's gems. Though this brings me to an episode that still confuses me even after watching it a few more times over. A Day at the Aquarium. Here it seemed like Anne was gonna have to stay in Newtopia with Marcy in order to find out more about the temples that can restore said gems. So alright, there's some impact to the story, that's a nice start, but what threw me off was, well, where it goes from there. The conflicts played off like they absolutely have to do everything as explained. Like Anne will never get the chance to see the planters again after that day. I already had a feeling that wasn't going to be the case, but they still overplayed the whole conflict regardless. Sure, there may have been some interesting moments seeing all the implications to their past adventures at the aquarium, but that's just one detail I could think of that I actually liked from this episode. And it didn't help that they overplayed the sadness. I usually wouldn't mind that trope this much, but dang, did they go overboard with it. After a while, it just started to feel more repetitive, instead of the emotional feel that I guess they were trying to go for. Anne ends up going back with the planters anyway, which just made most of this episode feel like it was for nothing. Which, given the details of this episode, just made it more of a problem than it could have been. If they did something else during their last day in Newtopia, like had they gone to different places and added more variety to their day and not burst into tears every minute or so, I feel I would have probably liked this episode more. And like I said before, there are times where I usually don't mind generic hangout episodes, and this one had the potential to be a decent one too. I just feel they could have gone more smoothly with the tone. Thankfully, this was the only episode I really had any sort of issues with this season. The rest of the season still came out pretty good. but there's still more to unfold even when they get back to Wartwood. Like in the episode, well, Return to Wartwood, where the planners try to tie up the loose ends with the citizens there, and there was the Halloween special, The Shut-In, which kind of followed the typical Simpsons Treehouse of Horror formula. 3 non-canon stories to fit the spooky atmos. Whether it was an experiment or not, I still found it kinda cool they gave this kind of episode structure a try. And most importantly, they had to find the temples, and of course, the Calamity Box, which led to some unfortunate drama after Anne finds out about Hop Pop's intentions with it, but the tension's restored as the major temple run starts. And they got Marcy to help them too, just in time. The first temple was indeed quite an adventure, along with the reconciliation of Anne and Hop Pop. There was quite the challenge that awaited them, which led to some quick thinking and planning. Honestly, I felt the first temple had a nice runtime. I felt giving it a whole episode of its own was a smart move, both to establish what's to be expected by these temples, and to give everyone a chance to think about what the rest of the temples would be like. And even with the crunch on time for the next 2 temples, I still thought their journeys were handled pretty well regardless. The 11-minute time run seemed like it was a pretty good choice. The writers made the most of what they could with the last 2 temples for the 11-minute time slots. At first, the kids thought this would be the end of their troubles, and Andreas would do his part to help the kids get back to the real world, right?
Wrong-o.
It was hinted at a couple times beforehand, and a reveal finally springs out. Andreas, as it turns out, was the true evil. Well, not the true evil. There was another force driving him, but I'll bring more of that up later. And this twist alone unleashes the start of a whole new story arc, which fully comes into effect in Season 3. The finale, along with the Andreas reveal, was another great form of closure. And not only that, this had details that gave the writers a far bigger step than they had back in Season 1. These writers were not afraid to give the show a dark side, and this finale drastically proves it. If it wasn't obvious enough, I loved most of Season 2. This season was so eventful, there was much more to learn in this season alone, and the finale left us off on an extreme and suspenseful note, leaving a lot of questions behind, like how bad will Amphibia turn out with Andreas in power? What's gonna happen with Sasha and Grime now that they're reformed? Is Marcy gonna end up okay? I mean, she was stabbed. And most of all, how's Anne gonna get back and save everyone? And what's up with her newly discovered gem power? Is that what we're calling it? Alright, I guess that's what we're going for. Well, all this and more would eventually be covered in the 3rd season. And as we all know, this was where the show was on its last legs, Season 3. This may sound weird, as I should have been on the ball by this point, especially when I remembered how invested I was in Season 2, but at some points, I wasn't entirely sure what to make of this season. Sure, it's nice to see that Anne finally made it back to the real world, and it was pretty fun to see the planters experience it at times, and of course it was still heartily story-driven. But at the same time, this also kind of felt like Season 1, where it would drag a bit more than it probably should have. But that was mostly due to the Cloakbot, a robot Andreas sent to the real world. With that thing being one of the few big threats Andreas had them deal with in the real world, it was no surprise that Cloakbot would get dull, and fast. Although his first big episode, The New Normal, gave him a decent impression. The 20-minute frame was enough to show us what he was capable of, and he did manage to come off as a threatening enemy. He seemed very promising at the time. But after that, his episodes started to feel more redundant. Like in every episode he was listed in, I already knew he was gonna show up and strike. We see him do that plenty of times, and his attacks started feeling very similar to one another. And the 10-minute frame didn't help much either. He started to feel more like a pushover as time went on. But to be fair, not all of Cloakbot's episodes were stale after his debut. The writers still knew how to make him unique from time to time, with one of the biggest episodes being Anne's Terminator, which also happened to be Cloakbot's final attack too. This time his life literally depended on it, as he blew up after failing, and he was put on a time limit no less, but at least he still managed to give off a decent fight during his final act. And he still got a bit of use even after dying, particularly in Spider Sprig, after he was discovered by a temporary rival trying to outdo Sprig as a superhero. Those were interesting adventures we got from Cloakbot, but those were really the only times he grabbed my attention. Thankfully, he wasn't the only threat they ran into during their journey. Shortly after Cloakbot got the boot, the heroes had to avoid a new threat, Mr. X. And this guy made a much better villain. He was more prepared, with not just his own devices, but his own troops for backup as well. Plus, he also had some more memorable scenes and charming one-liners. If anything, I felt bad that we didn't get more of this guy. Maybe we could have seen him and Cloakbot meet together, and probably even team up in some way. That could have had the potential for a suspenseful story arc. Besides that, there were still a few episodes that stood out on their own this season, like Hollywood Hop Pop, where, obviously, Hop Pop explores Hollywood, and he meets a doppelganger voiced by Wallace Shawn, which made it more amusing. Or again, there's Spider Sprig. Sprig as a superhero was a rather charming concept. If You Give a Frog a Cookie involved the planters trying to escape a mad scientist. And of course there was the Christmas special, Froggy Little Christmas, an episode that had both a surprise fight scene and quite a wholesome Christmas feel. But there was one other episode that opened up a pretty big story arc for the season, Olivia and Yunin. We learned that, yes, Marcy did survive the stab, but celebrations are cut short as Andreas catches her before she can escape. And she ends up getting possessed by the other source of evil alongside Andreas, the Core.
Why, hello there.
Hello there.
Of course, Anne had to get back to Amphibia at some point, just to offer her help and save Marcy and everyone else from Andreas and the Core. But even when they do get back, they still have more obstacles to encounter before they can get face to face with him again. To some this may feel like padding, but if anything, I'm kinda glad they included some of these extra threats, as most of these particular enemies go all the way back to the first season. I never properly brought this up in previous reviews, even though I should have, but if played right, this can usually be a smart move in any average story. In a way, it's sorta like the writers are testing us to see how much we were paying attention or how much we remembered, kinda like Chekhov's shotgun. These enemies appear in the first season, and then we see them come back in the third season. But maybe they had something else in mind. Whether it was intentional to bring them back or not, they still found ways to make it work. They brought back Barry, who cursed Sprig when they last ran into each other back in Cursed. Yes, that's the episode's title. His return was quite a twist, as you'd never think he'd be capable of pulling off all that he did this time around. And Toadie finally got to give the enemies what for. We also got to see the return of... Gary, who originally tricked Hop Hop into giving the kids that mind control cream back in Children of the Spore. Yeah, we all knew he was gonna come back after that cliffhanger from his debut episode. It was only a matter of time when he'd come back. Barry, on the other hand, was more of a surprise. There were practically no implications of him returning. But regardless, his intentions this time around still felt kinda fitting with his personality. And after a few more obstacles and confrontations, we finally get to the big fight against Andreas, as he's found his way into the real world and unleashed his full potential army, with his troops and resources we've seen throughout his reign of terror all forming into one attack. And Cloakbot comes off as more of a threat again, as Andreas sent out more than one this time, and they work in groups. See? This would have greatly helped the first Cloakbot the first time around, or maybe when Andreas sent out some backup from when he crashed the Christmas parade. Of course, this whole fight was gonna lead to something far bigger than anything we've ever seen before. And the final blow had an emotional side to it too, as Andreas learned the truth about his long-lost friend, Leaf. And this drove him to start turning over a new... well, Leaf. And Darcy is no more, as Sasha frees Marcy from the Core. And, okay, Marcy did acknowledge her mistakes, and she's gone through a lot of trouble during this whole time here, so I guess it's fair for her friends to forgive her in this case, as they've also learned to improve themselves. So, this must be it, huh? Loose ends have been tied up, story arcs have been brought to a close, the major battle was wrapped up and the three girls are finally together again and ready to say goodbye to Amphibia? This must be where the adventure ends, right? Wrong! Even after the massive brawl we got, there was one final challenge they had to encounter. And what was that? The moon falling toward our heroes. Yeah, they basically went all Majora's Mask on us. Remember when I said this story had a ton of references? Well, that's one of them. Which, hey, that's perfectly fine on its own. I like Majora's Mask as much as the next guy. But still, after everything we saw in the last episode, with the huge attack and the dramatic fight and the loose ends being tied up, this conflict just felt, well, a little off. It mostly felt like a decision that was tossed in at the last minute. I feel this could have worked if it was implied during different parts of the show. Like say for example they had to stop the moon at an earlier point, and then maybe find out it was being controlled by the Core after Sasha frees Marcy from its control. Yes, I know, the Core had to control the moon too, but you mean to tell me it couldn't have found a way to make some kind of failsafe to cause the moon to fall even after its possible death? Yes, it didn't die, but had Sasha smashed the core helmet or something, it would have automatically been the end of the action. Again, I just feel this final adventure could have done a little better with the build-up. Let me put it this way, remember how Gravity Falls ended? The finale was split up into 3 parts, and each part had a more thorough setup, which made the conflicts feel like they were going through a smoother flow. We knew they had to take down Bill in the end, so the final encounter both made more sense and was more anticipated. so maybe if there were some sort of implications or brief hints towards the core's final failsafe, I feel this conflict could have probably had just as nice an impact. But despite my criticisms, I still thought what we got instead from the wait and the build-up was greatly worth it. I mean, there were still some very interesting details we got from this episode. We finally got to see all three girls at their full potential, as this fight gave them a chance to use their stone powers together. The whole fight was pretty fun to watch overall, and there were a few scenes that gave off some well-deserved closure, like Andreas giving his support and obtaining his freedom. And even Anne had some emotional bits too, like when it really looked like she was gonna die, but instead she got summoned by the Cosmic Guardian. Yeah, the Guardian was also pretty cool and all, but just like with the core and the moon, this also kind of felt like it was a last minute decision. Like it just came out of nowhere. Its reveal could have been more interesting if there were any signs of this thing's existence in the first place. Like maybe if there were implications that was watching them this whole time, which could have led to a smaller story arc that gave more of a mysterious feel to it. Plus that could have made for a more interesting and more worthwhile feeling payoff. But despite all that, the overall closure we got anyway, not just for this episode, but the whole show, was admittedly really touching. I can't stress that enough. Knowing that the girls would have to leave everyone in this world behind and never get to see them again? Well, that would be enough to make anyone shed tears. As for me, well, I had mixed emotions on this. Yeah, I already kinda knew it was gonna lead to this in the end. This kind of story has played out this way many times, but the way they played out some of these details still managed to make the execution come off sweet. Plus, I could tell the ending was gonna be sad regardless, as that girl in my workplace told me beforehand. Even still, I'm not trying to sound tough or anything, but given the heavily emotional media I've been exposed to throughout my life, it would have to take a lot to make me cry nowadays. Like the last thing I remember watching that legit made me cry was the Assassination Classroom finale. Something on that level of strength would most likely do me in and set off my waterworks. But like I was saying, this show still had its own beautiful moments. I especially loved the last few episodes. There was much more at stake, there were a handful of deeper moments than usual, and let's not forget the time skip epilogue they added at the very end. To see both the Wartwood residents and the girls all grown up and adapting after everything they've been through years ago. Knowing that they still remembered each other after their long absence away from each other, and will most likely continue holding on to those memories in the later years of their lives. So thus ends the story, and wow.
Wow.
This was quite a ride. A ride of twists from inside and out, from within the story, and from the outside by my own expectations. While I wouldn't say the show was as amazing as other shows I've covered so far, I'd still kinda pick the Owl House over this, but I also found Amphibia to be unexpectedly enjoyable. Even though I found some details could have been handled a little better with some more planning in different ways, the show still offered a lot of elements that worked surprisingly well, and gave me a lot more to say than expected. Seriously, I was not expecting the script to be this long, not even close. Regardless of what I've been saying, I would have loved to have had that experience to see all these episodes when they were still brand new, just to feel some of the hype alongside everyone else. So if that girl from my workplace happens to be watching this, I'd like to thank you for recommending this show to me. I would have most likely kept avoiding the show if it wasn't for you, so I thank you for motivating me to give it a try. And I'd also like to thank everyone who made it to the end of this video. But not all hope is lost. Supposedly, there's a rumor going around that there might be a movie coming out for this show, but I know nothing about this, so I can't confirm nor deny it. But should it end up actually coming to light, I'll be sure to give it a watch and probably end up preparing for a separate video on it. And even if this turns out to be nothing more than just a rumor, then I'm sure someday there'll still be a completely different show via Disney or some other station that'll give us similar feels to Amphibia or even the Owl House. Something new where we learn about human characters being stuck in an alternate world and learning how to improve themselves, or learn to accept themselves, or go through their own discoveries in ways that the viewers can relate to. A show that can leave people feeling for these characters and offer the audience something that we'll all remember for years to come. But we'll soon see, won't we?